All right. Well, welcome to the third episode of the Off the Clock podcast, and today we're going to talk about Japanese whiskey. Once again, I'm Alan, bartender, and today I'm going to take a look at this Forbes article called "The End of Fake Japanese Whiskey." Industry announces sweeping new regulations. But before we talk about this, fake Japanese whiskey, let's talk about what Japanese whiskey actually is, in case you guys, some of you guys are not familiar. For those people who are familiar with Japanese whiskey, you're probably thinking of something like a Yamazaki, which is probably the most famous of all the Japanese whiskeys. And there's two main distilleries that make, or two main companies that make Japanese whiskeys. It's either going to be Suntory or Nikka. And Suntory's, they have three distilleries: the Yamazaki, the Hakushu, which is what makes the peated expressions of the company. That is like the smokier style of whiskeys. And then third is the Cheetah, which produces grain whiskeys through a continuous still, and these are used to make the blends for like the Hibiki and then the Toki expressions. And Nikka has two distilleries, the Miyagikyo and the Yoichi. And Miyagikyo, I believe, also has a column still, which they use to make the Nikka coffee grain and coffee malt whiskeys. So those are the two standards. They've been around for over 100 years, and they basically ran the Japanese whiskey market, this whole time. And it wasn't until the Yamazaki, especially the 18 year, that started winning a lot of awards. That's when a lot of people started paying attention to Japanese whiskeys. And what happened? So let's talk about what Japanese whiskey is, the traditional style. The Japanese whiskey originally was adopted from Scotch whiskey. They had some Japanese sake brewing, like a chemist, went to Scotland to study distillery. And when he came back, he tried to make some whiskey in Japan. But the problem is nobody knows how to do it, and there's no distilleries. So in Scotland, what they normally do is they make blends where they buy different whiskeys from different distilleries, and then they blend them. In Japan, especially when you're just starting to make whiskey for the first time, there's no other company. So what happens is a lot of Japanese companies, they make multiple distilleries on their own. So all their blends are actually house blended in-house. For example, the Hibiki is a blend of Yamazaki, Hakushu, and Cheetah whiskeys, which is all under Suntory. Versus in Scotland, you would have like a Johnny Walker, which would buy some stuff from I forgot which distilleries, but there's like 100 of them, and they're like somewhat secret and all that stuff. So in the beginning, that's how Japanese whiskeys was made, and that's what brought them to win a lot of medals. So, a lot of other companies started jumping in too, because here's the thing about Japanese whiskeys. For the longest time, there was no law that says what can be labeled. It's not like bourbon, where there's specific laws that are written on how bourbon needs to be made. In Japan, it was pretty much just Suntory and Nikka doing this the way that they learned it from the Scots. And so most people, when they think of Japanese whiskeys, they just assume that's a natural style. The only law that was written that makes a Japanese whiskey is that it has to be bottled in Japan. In fact, there's actually some Japanese whiskeys where they buy rye whiskey, or they buy like whiskey from Canada, and they just age them in a barrel that's inside of an abandoned railroad for like a second, and now they bottle it, and now bam, that's our Japanese whiskey, which is like, the whiskey isn't even made in Japan, but because of the laws aren't defined, anyone could make Japanese whiskeys. And what happened recently is because of the demand of Japanese whiskeys, the Nikka and the Suntory whiskeys gone up. A lot of these shochu distilleries wanted to make their own whiskeys just by aging their shochu. For those who don't know who shochu is a distillation of sake. So it's very similar to soju, which is a the Korean version. But the Korean version is usually made from sweet potatoes and other types of grains. But the shochu, it's a distillate made from sake, so it has to go through the same process with a koji mold fermentation. So anyways, let's fast forward to what's going on today. There has been a surge of Japanese whiskeys, but they're very deceptive because they're not done in the style of what Nikka and Yamazaki has been doing. And that's how Japanese whiskeys got to this popularity, is because of what they were doing. So now you have all these other companies they're like, hey, we could make whiskey too. Let's just age our shochu. And a lot of these go for artificially high prices. You know, people are like, oh, this tastes like this sweetness. But if you taste it, it's just aged shochu. And it's like very deceptive. And it kind of sucks for these two companies who've been doing it the Scottish way. And there have been these smaller distilleries and companies are capitalizing on their success. So what's happening here is that now people are starting to govern things, especially this article. So let's take a look. Okay, so the Japanese Spirits and Liqueurs Makers Association has announced a sweeping new set of industry-wide regulations aimed at curbing the spread of products labeled as Japanese whiskey that are sometimes nothing of the sort. So this is what the fake whiskey is. They're just taking advantage of how lax the definition of the Japanese whiskey is, that a lot of people, they're just making, like I said earlier, just, aged rice distillates. But Yamazaki, the single malts are all barley based, which is like how they do it in Scotland as well. So for most of its modern history, Japanese whiskey has adopted the opposite approach to the Scots, where the latter has some of the strictest laws in the world about what is allowed to be called Scotch whiskey. Japanese whiskey makers haven't had significant regulations on the matter in place until now. The ongoing supply crisis has roiled the Japanese whiskey industry for years, meant that a lack of regulation has led to many companies cutting corners and pushing the boundaries on what actually constitutes as whiskey produced in the country. Some tricks include importing Scotch whiskey and bottling that as Japanese, or even mixing Scotch imported whiskeys with shochu. And as I mentioned earlier, sometimes not even from Scotland. There's Japanese whiskeys that come from distillates that they get from Canada. Which is a country that's not even known that well for making high quality whiskey, with a few exceptions. Major Japanese whiskey industry figures have previously expressed significant concern about what this means for the future of the industry, and that it might dent the confidence of consumers. Because imagine this, and I've seen it happen. One time I was going whiskey shopping, and this lady, she wanted to get a Yamazaki 12, and she asked the clerk or someone walking around, and he couldn't even give an answer. And I was explaining to her, I was like, none of these whiskeys that they have on sale are anything close to what you're looking for. Like, you're looking for a Yamazaki 12. I could recommend you a Taiwanese whiskey that probably bears more resemblance to Yamazaki 12 than these other, the aged shochus, because this is like all deceptive, and a lot of these fake Japanese whiskeys, they're not cheap. You associate Japan as being like a very honest and hardworking culture, but just like the US is full of a lot of capitalist greed, and they'll take advantage of whatever they can get. Okay. So, unlike in Scotland, these new regulations aren't legally binding, but they are a strong show of force from the industry, and it will lead to significant change. Starting April 1st of this year, here's the criteria that any brand wanting to release a product featuring the label Japanese whiskey will need to meet. So you notice that the spelling is different here. One of the easiest ways to memorize which spelling it is if the name of the country has an E, then it spells the whiskey with an E as well. And if you look at Maker's, the only company that I've seen make this exception is Maker's Mark, where they actually adopted the without the E. But either way, it's spelled correctly. Let's go over the rules and see, let's compare them to the methods that are done with Scotch whiskey. And remember, these are not laws. These are just agreements. Scotland, they're very strict, so they have laws, so you can get fined. So these hopefully will, there's no really enforcement on this, but this is just one step getting closer. So okay, let's look at these rules. The only raw ingredients allowed for use in production are malted grains, other cereal grains, and water extracted in Japan. Malted grains must always be used. So, if you look at single malt Scotch, a lot of these are malted barley, like 100% malted barley. Like Yamazaki and Hakushu, when you buy the whiskey that's labeled Yamazaki or Hakushu, which are the names of the distilleries, those are going to be 100% malted barley. So that's the same thing as in Scotland. If you buy a Michelin, 100% malted barley from that distillery. Okay. Fermentation, distillation, and saccharification must take place in a distillery located in Japan, with the alcohol volume of the distillate not allowed to go above 95% in strength. So that means that they can't buy their source, from someone else that's outside the country. And alcohol volume of the distillate not allowed to go to 95%. So this is particular for the grain whiskeys that are used to lighten the blends. So in that case, those are most likely going to be corn, which has a more neutral flavor. Okay, wood casks with a maximum of 700 liters must be used for the maturation. Matured in Japan for a minimum of 3 years. Yeah, same thing as very similar to Scotland. Bottling has to take place in Japan, and the whiskey has a minimum ABV of 40%. So this was probably the only rule that they had before all the fake whiskeys were coming out. Plain caramel coloring is allowed to be added. So this is actually true. Like Scotland, they are actually allowed to add caramel coloring. In fact, there's even like black whiskeys where it's completely like artificially darkened. It's pretty insane, and it is very controversial. I think it is noticeable. Like the reason why they do this is to make the color, the batch from batch, like consistent. But I would rather, I don't like. So this is a debate that we're going to talk about another day. One exception about caramel coloring is being allowed is in American whiskeys. So bourbon and rye do not allow any coloring. So you'll notice that different batches of the same bourbon will have a different color. Okay. The regulations also come down hard on any brands that would like to evoke Japanese imagery and names on their labels for a whiskey product that doesn't meet the above requirements. Once again, a lot of people are very fascinated by Japanese culture, and a lot of these companies would buy whiskey from Scotland or Canada and make it look like they've been doing this for like 400 years, and the company is like not even like, it's just an office space. It's not even like a distillery. This might not seem like much, but these standards align Japanese whiskey with what is happening in other parts of the world that are also producing whiskey, such as the European Union. Yeah, like the French are starting to produce whiskey, and even in Asia, you have Taiwanese whiskey. And even India, a lot of Indian whiskeys are just rum, but now that they're actually making single malt whiskeys and they're trying to legitimize the term Indian whiskey, they're now starting to like put more strict agreements on what you can call Indian whiskey. Okay. Here's a great, if messy, graphic from Japanese site, which I did for the brand. Oh, interesting. Let's take a look at this. Didn't see this. Oh yeah, I've seen this before. So this is a chart of I'll put this on a link below. But yeah, it shows you where they get I've seen this before. It's a fake or a real distillery, and you can see right here I mentioned the Miyagikyo single malt, Miyagikyo Nikka coffee malt. Yep, yeah, like I said, they have coffee. So coffee is not the coffee that you drink. Coffee is the name of the guy who invented the column still, and the Miyagikyo right here. These coffees stills they bought from Scotland, and they were in 1965, I think. So yeah, look at here, Yoichi, Taketsuru, and the single malt. So the Taketsuru, I believe, is a vatted malt. So it's still single malt, but it's from two different distilleries. Let's look at, where is that? Oh yeah, here. This is Suntory right here. You got Yamazaki, Chida, and the Hakushu, and you can see that Hibiki is a blend of I think it's a blend of all three. And then the Kakubin is the original Yamazaki whiskey, which looks like a turtle shell. Okay, Chichibu. So this is another good distillery that a lot of people don't talk about, but but they're freaking their stuff is really good. Oh yeah, White Oak. So they now follow the rules, but in the beginning they were actually rum based, but now they're grain based. I mean, so they in the beginning they were molasses based because there was the rules were so lax. So okay. Yeah, see some of these. Oh, so this one, the Taguchi is the one I believe gets their whiskey from Canada, and they age them in railroad tracks. Okay, so yeah, if you guys have time, I'll put this link, and so you guys can make your decisions. Because in the end, it's still going to be an honor system. They're not going to put these into laws yet, but yeah, if you guys want to buy Japanese whiskeys and you don't have any Yamazaki around, I highly recommend looking at this chart. I'll put this on the link. I'll put the link of this on the description below. Okay, let's close that. The Whiskey Exchange is the world's largest online retailer of whiskey, and it has announced that it will soon recategorize its products they sell as Japanese whiskey. So that's good. So a lot of companies, they want to be transparent as well and not deceptive. So, because right now, this is all an agreement. We're not, nobody's going to enforce this. So it's going to be honor system based. But even as a bartender, I worked in a Japanese whiskey bar, so I'm always going to be honest. And like, this is what you're thinking, this is what you want if you want a Yamazaki style. And these are just shochus that are aged. And they taste completely different. And they're not... so you don't want to get ripped off with a lot of these misinformation that's been spreading. Blah, blah, blah. However, while it is important to note that while many companies behind Japanese whiskey brands have agreed to abide by the regulations voluntarily, whiskey writer and author Dave Broom warns that this may not be the end of fake Japanese whiskey. Yeah. Again, this is all agreements, gentlemen's agreements. Nothing's currently going to be put into law just yet. As it stands, there's nothing to stop a bottler shochu producer who isn't a member of the association to continue to release dubiously labeled liquid. Yeah, this is a problem. You have to be in this association to agree for this, but some people just refuse. It's like, why should we refuse? There's no repercussions. And they're just going to continue selling fake Japanese whiskey. I hope we see some form of producer's label sticker appearing, blah, blah. Yeah, if you look at tequila, they have a organization that regulates tequila called the NOM. And you can get an app called the Tequila Matchmaker, and you can look up exactly where these tequilas are coming from. So maybe they'll form a official, like some kind of sticker or logo, and you can look it up yourself. And while the other people outside the organization, the associations, won't have anything, and will be how you can spot a real Japanese whiskey that follows these rules, or is it just an imitation, or just a dubiously labeled product? Yeah. For Japanese whiskey fans and for many in the industry, the announcement is a welcome step to providing more transparency about what's in the bottle. The next few weeks are going to be fascinating for anyone keeping tabs on what's happening in Japanese whiskey. So yeah, I'm pretty interested. In this because I used to work in a Japanese whiskey bar, and we did carry both the real one and the fake one. But this was at a time where Yamazaki was still being affordable, and there was no reason for the bartenders to like lie to the guests. And I I'm always pretty honest. Like people, you can ask. Yeah, in fact, I think it's more clear because I'm not saying that aged shochu is bad, because like there's actually some that taste pretty good, but they are definitely not the same category, especially when you're talking about flavor wise, what a lot of these Japanese whiskey fans are looking for. So yeah, that's what I want to talk about. I don't know what you guys out there, what your experiences with Japanese whiskeys, or if you had them before. Yeah, this is going to be interesting because this is less than a month away. So we'll see how labels are going to change in a Japanese whiskey. Maybe the older bottles are going to be worth more because of the changes in these labels. But yeah, that was today's episode of Off the Clock. And please leave in the comments below on what kind of questions you have on Japanese whiskey, and I'll try to answer all of them. What kind of Japanese whiskeys you like. Heck, even talk about if you had like Taiwanese or French whiskeys. Leave that on. Let me know about them as well. And if you haven't done so already, don't forget to like and subscribe. And I'll see you guys on the next episode.